Here we go. So we wrapped up the story of Samson yesterday. And the question that we are asking all last semester and this semester is, what is the point? What is the purpose of this passage? And what is the purpose of this passage as it relates to the whole book, or maybe the section of a book? There is a point, there is a purpose. And we call that tracing the argument, because having a purpose or a point in a passage of scripture, the author is going to construct whatever kind of literature we are dealing with. They're going to construct the argument around supporting that point. And we saw that last semester when we were looking at epistles. That is a great place to start with this whole process of figuring out the purpose and the argument of a book, because an epistle is usually a fairly brief piece of literature that has a specific problem to address, an issue to talk about. There, a lot of times in Paul's epistles, there are some doctrinal things that he needs to clarify, correct error. And so it's usually fairly straightforward, even if the author doesn't specifically state, this is why I am writing to you. If we don't find that statement, it is still fairly straightforward in an epistle what the main concern of the writer is. And once we can identify that, then we can take a look at the entire epistle, even a long one like Hebrews or Romans, and we can see how the writer took us from point to point to point to achieve the goal or the purpose of the writing. For your papers, which are due when?
Which I'm in the final, or next week.
Next week is the next section that is due, which is a few questions that you need to answer. So as you are working on that, and you have consulted some secondary sources about what the purpose of the book is, where your passage is found, that gives you a focus, and it gives you a direction as you read through a passage of scripture. And one of the questions in general that you should be asking is this passage a part of the main point, or is this a supporting point? In other words, if the main point is justification is by faith, it is by the grace of God through faith, and you see that in a couple of Paul's letters. Let's take Galatians as an example. He is addressing a problem there with the churches in Galatia, that they have adopted a Judaistic legalism in place of the gospel. And so his main point is to show that justification is by faith, or by grace through faith. And everything that he says in the epistle to the Galatian churches is going to support that point. And so you read through it, and you can ask a question: is Paul addressing in these couple of verses in this paragraph, is he addressing that main point, or is he giving support to his main point? Is he giving us an illustration from the Old Testament that shows that justification comes through faith alone and not by works of the law, things like that? So there are questions that we are learning to ask that help us to understand the whole purpose of the entire book. And then we can narrow that down to our passage, our verse, the statement that we are examining, and even down to the key word in the verse that you are examining. So continue with that for next week, where that section of your paper is done. This semester, we took that whole idea, that whole question about the purpose of a book and how the book is put together. And we have been looking at narrative. After we are done with narrative, we are going to look at poetry. We're going to look at a psalm, and we're going to see how we can take the same questions about the purpose and the argument, and we can examine poetry. And what we are learning is that depending on the kind of literature we are looking at, that tells us what to look for, what to expect. In an epistle, we expect a fairly brief, logically constructed argument to prove a point. In narrative, we see characters, plot, conflict, and we see in biblical literature especially, rather than things being built specifically around a timeline like we have in Western literature, we have a theme, we have a topic that is being developed, and it can be developed a couple of different ways. In the book of Judges, we see a repeated cycle. We see that after the time of Joshua, Joshua's generation knew the Lord. The generation afterwards remembered the Lord, knew the Lord. But right after that, we read in Judges 2, verse 10, that a generation, that following generation, did not know the Lord nor his works. And we talked about the impact of that and how that came about. But that starts a decline in the nation of Israel. And now we have narrative, we have stories that are told one after the other that pick up that theme of what happens when a people, especially the nation of Israel, when they walk away from their covenant agreement with the Lord to possess the land. The conditions for being in the land was to walk in obedience with the Lord, and the Lord said, do not do certain things. Do not intermarry with these other people. Do not worship their gods, and things like that. And what happens? They start doing exactly what they were told not to do. And what's the result of that? Exactly what God said would happen. He would not bless them. Rather, he would bring punishment in certain ways. And we see this cycle of the Israelites falling into sin, and then they are oppressed, and they finally get to the point in their oppression where they cry out to the Lord. He brings a judge to deliver them from their oppressors. That is the opportunity for the people to respond. There's a little time of revival, and they then enter into a period of peace and rest. And then shortly after that, they fall back into their old ways. And this cycle is repeated over and over again. But not only is it just the same cycle, every time they go through the cycle, things deteriorate more and more and more, to the point where we saw in the Samson narrative that not only are the people indistinguishable from their pagan neighbors, so is the judge. The judge has deteriorated to the point where there's barely any, if any, spiritual awareness in the character and life of the judge. So in order to see how that theme is developed and to understand, well, then what is the point of the Samson narrative? In fitting in with this entire structure for the book of Judges, what does Samson's narrative show us? There are a few key elements in there. And so we're going to start looking at those today in order to ask the question, how is the story constructed? What is the writer emphasizing? What is the point? What is the purpose of the Samson narrative? So I'm going to share my screen. We are going to take a look at some notes. If we were in the classroom together, I would have this up on the screen, but we're not there. So this is how we're going to go through things here. I will put a copy of this in Campus SIS so that you can go back and consult these notes as you have opportunity. And this is a kind of serves as a model for what are some of the things that we should do when we are dealing with a narrative passage in order to figure out the purpose of that passage. So we're starting here. Here's one of the typical artistic renderings of Samson in the temple. Brittany, this doesn't look like he's pushing on wooden pillars. So doing a little bit of historical research and things, we do see up here at the top some wood. So maybe there's a little bit of authenticity to this depiction. But this is the typical thing that we think of and see. And if you look in the background, we see Dagon back there. So whoever painted this depiction of the destruction of the temple did a fairly good job, I would think. We're still not sure if Samson was actually a muscle-bound guy or if he was just supernaturally strong, but they don't necessarily cancel each other out. So, all right, so let's take a look at the Samson narrative. It's always important to focus everything on the context and to make sure that we know where we are in the overall narrative. So here, the Samson narrative opens up with the Philistine oppression, and they have dominion over Israel for 40 years at the time that Samson comes on the scene. Now, remember, we talked, I think it was yesterday, we mentioned that a cycle of judges talks about the period of time that a judge is doing their work as a judge. And usually that begins at the defeat of the enemy. And we are told in the first 5 judges especially, that there is a period of rest and quiet while the judge is judging Israel. From the time of Gideon on, we don't read about that. We read about periods of oppression. We read about how many years the judge was in the role of judge, but the periods of rest and quiet go away. And there is a continual oppression of the people. So when Samson comes on the scene, they already have been under the thumb of Philistines for 40 years. At a point in Samson's life, he judges Israel for 20 years. The conclusion of his life, when he causes the destruction of the temple of Dagon there in Gaza, we don't read about a period of rest. And so the Philistines are still around. Samson has delivered a significant defeat to the people of the Philistines. But as we move from Judges into the historical books with 1 Samuel, Samuel is still in the position of a judge. The Philistines are still around, and they are still there when we get to the time of David. So it's a really interesting cycle to see things that are discussed in the book of Judges, and then that we are not seeing the people of Israel entering into a time of rest again. We hope to see that when the Samson narrative begins, because his story begins with the announcement that his mother is going to bear a son. He's going to be a Nazirite from his birth, and he's going to begin to deliver Israel from the Philistines. So we have a lot of expectation on this guy, Samson. We are very quickly disappointed in that expectation. And we see a judge who is frustrated to no end his entire life. So in Judges 13, we have the story of his birth, and we are introduced to the whole idea of irony in this narrative. This is dramatic irony. It's used as what's called a plot device. That means we see it popping up all through the story, and it carries the story forward. That's a plot device. We are also introduced to the conflicts that are going to happen throughout the Samson narrative. And the fact is that the story is introduced with the Philistines oppressing Israel. In Judges 14, we have Samson's marriage. And we see that God uses this opportunity to bring the conflict between Israel and the Philistines. It takes root here in chapter 14 with the marriage of Samson. The marriage of Samson ends with the death of 30 Philistines, and Samson leaving in anger and going back to his father's house and leaving his wife with her family. We talked about how this is all the indications, especially at the beginning of chapter 15, is that this is an exogamous marriage, meaning that she would stay with her father anyway. But the fact is that Samson left in anger, and that impressed his father-in-law to come to the conclusion Samson doesn't want to have anything to do with her, doesn't want to have anything to do with them. And so he gives his daughter away to another man. In Judges 15, we see that the broken marriage vow, the broken marriage covenant, leads to the escalation of the conflict between Samson and the Philistines. And that is that his wife and her family are killed by Philistines, and the whole conflict escalates. And we also see in that chapter how the Israelites don't know what's going on. That's another part of the irony in there that is really very interesting. So the conflict escalates in chapter 15, and it comes to a head in chapter 16 with the death of Samson, and we see that God accomplishes his purpose there. So those are some of the highlights in the story of Samson as it moves the story along. So what are some things then that we can pull out for how the story is written? Here we have how irony was used in the story. We have several points. The first indication we have that this story is going to use irony in its plot development is where Manoah, Samson's father, prays to send that guy back who said that we're going to have a child to teach us what to do. They don't know what to do. They know what the angel said. Don't let a razor touch the baby's head. He's going to be a Nazirite from birth. There were restrictions given to Samson's mother, but they don't know what to do. And this is a surprise to us, maybe not a deep surprise, because we have seen the deterioration, the spiritual decline of the nation of Israel from chapter 2, that the Israelites don't know the Lord. So somehow the Mosaic covenant and all of the information that is right there available for them, they're unaware of these things. A Nazirite and how the vow is supposed to work is detailed for us in Numbers chapter 6. So it's right there in written form for Israel to consult, but they don't know what to do. And so we begin here right away in chapter 13, kind of scratching our heads. How bad off are these people? And then we're told specifically in that same chapter that Manoah didn't know that this was an angel of the Lord who came to visit them. And we talked about the fact that, we can understand that. We are told in Hebrews that people entertain angels unaware. So angels don't walk around and flash a badge saying, here I'm from the department of whatever in heaven, and here are my credentials. They don't do that kind of thing. But this is the first time that the phrase "they did not know" is mentioned. And then it starts to repeat itself. And we realize, the author of the Samson narrative is pointing out to us specifically and on purpose that there was a lot going on during this time, and specifically in the life of Samson, that has to do with things that were not known. In chapter 14, we see how this ignorance, and not in a derogatory way, but this lack of knowledge, how it is perpetuated. It is used by the characters in the story to hide things from people. Samson did not tell, I skipped one, sorry, the ignorance of the purpose of what was going on. When Samson wanted to marry the Philistine woman, his parents didn't know that God was going to use this. And again, we can't blame them for that. But this, again, is one of those things where the writer is telling us specifically that people were unaware of what was going on. And then Samson, he kills the lion, and he doesn't tell anybody about that. He doesn't tell them about the honey that he finds and shares with people. And so the characters themselves are carrying this whole idea of ignorance with them in the story. In chapter 15, Samson did not know that he was no longer married to the Timnite woman. He goes to visit her. He takes the gift, like is supposed to happen in an exogamous marriage arrangement. He was going to visit his wife, takes the gift, and then finds out he's not married to her anymore. That was quite a shock. So he responds to that and leads us to the next statement of ironing. And this is where the people of Israel confront Samson, and they use this phrase, "Do you not know that the Philistines have dominion over us? Why are you doing what you are doing?" And this was an interesting reversal, kind of the other side of irony, where we talk about how Samson was to be the judge of Israel, to deliver Israel from the Philistines. But the Israelites have the whole thing backwards. And they're going to deliver Samson to the Philistines. And they present to him this statement of irony. Don't you know who the Philistines are? And this tells us they don't know who Samson is. So it's quite an interesting and a very artistic way to make use of irony in the story. And then the final statement of irony in the story is the pinnacle of the tragedy of the story of Samson. The way he has been living his life, the way he has been ignoring everything that he was supposed to do as a Nazirite, except his hair. He did not know that the Lord had departed from him. And he goes out and acts on the basis of presumption rather than faith. And this leads to his final downfall. So the use of irony is throughout the story of Samson, and it is used so much that it is very obvious that the story is written to point out this lack of knowledge having to do with all kinds of truth, all kinds of layers of spirituality that were supposed to be a part of the lives of the people of Israel. They had the written word of God. They had the Mosaic covenant. They had people who were supposed to be teaching them, the Levites especially, part of their job. As Israel was being organized as a nation under Moses, this is where judges were established. You remember Moses's father-in-law saw that Moses was in the role of a judge, and he was the only one doing that work. And so Moses's father-in-law said, "You're going to kill yourself if you keep this up." So they divided up groups, numbers of people, and appointed officers within each tribe. And there were chiefs of the tribes, and there were judges in the tribes. So when we get to the book of Judges, we don't see something brand new beginning. We see that God is equipping people who were in positions within all the tribes of Israel, leadership positions, and God enabled certain ones of those judges to do the work that he is going to do through them, to bring the Israelites back into a condition of peace and rest so that they can, hopefully learn their lesson and keep the terms of the covenant, which of course they didn't do. All right, so one of the other things that we see in the Samson narrative is Samson's words. We have more dialogue, or in many cases monologue, from Samson than we do in any of the other judges. We have a lot of the words of the judges. Some of them give us a paragraph or two. But when it comes to the Samson narrative, we see an awful lot of discussion going on, and Samson saying a lot of things. And it's worth looking at them, bringing them all together and looking at them, because in Matthew 12 and in Luke 6, the parallel passage in Luke 6, Jesus tells us that it is out of the abundance of the heart that the mouth speaks. So by looking at what Samson said, we get an insight into his heart. Here are things, this is everything that Samson said, and there are a couple of slides, not just this one. So let's take a look at some of the things that Samson said in this narrative that we have. I have seen a woman in Timnah of the daughters of the Philistines. Now, therefore, get her for me as wife. Get her for me, for she pleases me well. Let me pose a riddle to you. If you can correctly solve and explain it to me within the 7 days of the feast, then I will give you 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothing. But if you cannot explain it to me, then you shall give me 30 linen garments and 30 changes of clothing. Right. And here's his riddle. Out of the eater came something to eat, and out of the strong came something sweet. It's kind of cool that it rhymes in English. And then to his wife, he says, look, I have not explained it to my father or my mother, so should I explain it to you? Real nice guy. To the Philistines, he says, if you had not plowed with my heifer, you would not have solved my riddle. And this is where we learn how to communicate with our wives. All right. He says in chapter 15, let me go into my wife, into her room. And then in response to what happens, he says, this time I shall be blameless regarding the Philistines if I harm them. Since you would do a thing like this, I will surely take revenge on you, and after that, I will cease. As they did to me, so I have done to them. Swear to me that you will not kill me yourselves. With the jawbone of a donkey, heaps upon heaps, with the jawbone of a donkey, I have slain 1,000 men. You have given this great deliverance by the hand of your servant, and now shall I die of thirst and fall into the hand of the uncircumcised? This is the first time that we see Samson saying anything that resembles a prayer. And you can see here that was a complaint. And then in the Delilah pericope, if they bind me with 7 fresh bowstrings, not yet dried, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. If they bind me securely with new ropes that have never been used, then I shall become weak and be like any other man. If you weave the 7 locks of my head into the web of the loom, and you remember he didn't even complete that sentence. No razor has ever come upon my head, for I have been a Nazirite to God from my mother's womb. If I am shaven, then my strength will leave me, and I shall become weak and be like any other man. I will go out as before at other times and shake myself free. Let me feel the pillars which support the temple so that I can lean on them. O Lord God, remember me, I pray. Strengthen me, I pray, just this once, O God, that I may with one blow take vengeance on the Philistines from my 2 eyes. Let me die with the Philistines. Okay, what are your impressions by looking at Samson's words? What are your impressions of his character, his heart, the focus of his life, how he viewed things? What are your impressions of him?
He seems pretty self-centered. Like all of his things that he says are centered around like what he wants and stuff like that.
Yeah, that's how it strikes me too. Anything else stand out to you guys?
It's pretty fearless.
Yeah. And there are different kinds of fearlessness, aren't there? What are some ways that somebody can be fearless? Think about situations of danger and somebody exhibiting courage or fearlessness. They're not quite the same thing, but
You can definitely approach things with recklessness and complete lack of concern for your own well-being. Or you could approach it with, you could do something very dangerous and be really scared, but do it anyway. Or you can do it with confidence, neither reckless abandonment or fear.
Yeah, very good. Very good. As you go through the Samson narrative, you see him becoming more and more presumptuous. And we use that word on purpose because that's one of the things about the Delilah pericope that we talked about, is that he just figured nothing really matters anymore. It doesn't matter if my hair is gone or not, because of what he had done before in the past, given all of the violations of the Nazirite vow and all the successes that he had experienced and kind of bragged about with a jawbone of a donkey, I have slain 1,000 men, that kind of attitude. He's becoming more and more fearless, like you were talking about, but now it's moved into the point where he has a sense of being invulnerable, and he's just going to go out and, yeah, it doesn't matter. I've touched a lot of dead things, people, animals. I've been in the vineyards and all of that kind of stuff. And so my hair is gone. Okay. So I'm going to shake myself and go out as before. And because he didn't know, the Lord had departed from him. So yes, we do see Samson, when he is talking, if you compare his speeches with what we have in other judges, we do not see Samson speaking ever on behalf of the nation of Israel. It's always about himself. And there in the very end of chapters 15 and at the end of chapter 16, we see he judged Israel for 20 years. So he was in that position, but everything he talks about has to do with his own situation, vengeance for himself, anger, and revenge for things that happened to him. The position of a judge should be that of the biblical model of leadership that we see, unfortunately, rarely in the lives of people who are in leadership positions. Saul, even David, Solomon in his latter years, Solomon's son. And we have here judges who should be in leadership positions, exhibiting biblical wisdom and providing leadership. Samson is the worst example of any of that. His words have nothing to do with wisdom, leadership, and leading the nation back to compliance with the covenant that they were supposed to be living under. Well, that's all we have time for today. So we will pick this up next week. So continue working on your papers, the next section that is due. And we will wrap up this overview of the story of Samson and see how the structure of the story and the key elements in the story tell us what the story is about. All right. Well, you guys have a great weekend. We will see you next week.
Hey, Michael, I have a thought. If you
Yes.
want to spend 2 minutes talking about it.
Okay, go ahead.
Everyone doesn't have to stay. I was thinking, does Delilah represent a form of like ignorance in her own part? Because she keeps asking Samson what the source of his strength is, and he doesn't know, and she doesn't know. Even while like God is pretty clear that he wants the nations to know him through Israel, and
Yeah.
they don't know that it's that's where Samson's getting his strength. It's from God. They think it's either his hair, or like they can tie him up and then he can be withheld like that. Is
Yeah.
there an is
Yeah, there's kind of an indication that, the Philistines, like a lot of the people in Canaan at that time, were very superstitious and had like a magical thinking. And so Delilah kind of represents the Philistine view. It's kind of like, here's a weird analogy. Joan of Arc. Joan of Arc was so successful in defeating the English. This is kind of like the high point of the 100 Years' War. People could not explain her successes. And so when she was captured and brought to trial, they kept trying to pin on her some kind of sorcery. The only thing that could explain why she won so many battles for the French, it had to be some kind of sorcery. And so she was actually condemned as a heretic because they could not explain any other way what she was doing. So that kind of mindset, has been around forever, but you see that kind of reflected in Delilah, and whether or not this was actually her own conviction, we don't know, because she was paid to play that role. And she did it very well, and she manipulated Samson on the basis of his emotional involvement with her. He was in love with her, and she manipulated that. So that's a really good question. And the fact that she's the only one who's named of any of the women in his life is pretty interesting. So she represents a lot, and she's a key in the whole story. I think it does highlight what you were talking about: the Philistines' ignorance of what Samson was all about, Samson's own ignorance, the people of Israel, their whole ignorance. They just do not know what is going on. And in spite of all of that, God is there working and accomplishing his purpose. That's just mind-blowing.
Yeah. Thank you.
All right. Well, thanks. Good question.
Have a good weekend.
You too. See you.